Hey y'all, back with my biannual burst of motivation to make a video. So this one's gonna be a little less scripted, I think. Basically, I just wanted to talk about my most recent map. It's Test Chamber 317. It's a map that's heavily inspired from the Portal games and sits at around 30 or so rooms of high expert to low grandmaster gameplay. And I'll pretty much be spoiling like the entire map in this video, so if you haven't played it and it sounds interesting, go give it a try maybe. Personally, I think it's some of the best gameplay I've made for Celeste. Alright, shilling step done, let's get into it. So obviously, as I said, a lot of Test Chamber 317 was inspired by the Portal games, some of the most obvious parts being visually and mechanically. But I think another aspect I took inspiration from Portal is, well, the concept of literal test chambers, being many isolated challenges the player has to navigate through. So in a sense, I wanted to recreate this feeling of engaging in challenges, like, each room is its own chamber in a sense. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, I went into this map with a huge focus on each room having its own unique identity, and in a way making it feel almost less cohesive, which is weird and counterintuitive if we're talking about level design, yet it still ends up working, at least I think so. And I think one of the reasons for this is because the entire level is sort of like equally disjointed, so in this ironic twist, the fact that each room shares such little overlap in concepts is what makes the whole thing feel cohesive. I don't know if that makes sense. It might just be me. But another interesting takeaway is that this type of design philosophy really allowed me to push like a bunch of different mechanics together to try and keep things fresh, instead of doing my typical thing where I hyper focus on like a very limited entity palette, right? So in this map we have the falling blocks, we have the aerial faith plates, the falling block portals, the mobility gels, and then the make all falling blocks fall button. That's the official name. So a lot of mechanics, but what is it that makes it all work together, and how do these combinations of mechanics help, generate so many gameplay ideas for me? I think reflecting on these questions retrospectively, I've come to some pretty interesting conclusions, and at least for me personally, exploring this type of mechanical cohesion really helps me with creating gameplay. Here's what I mean. The main observation I made is that all of the mechanics I introduced in 317 have some sort of interactive behavior directly with another mechanic, which is the falling block. So the aerial faith plates, for example, it'll launch the players a certain distance, but they also have this direct interaction with the falling blocks, making them do this funny bounce. The portals themselves, they're created around the falling blocks, and then the mobility gels, I made this design decision to have them also be present on falling blocks. And then obviously lastly, the switches drop the falling blocks. So what's interesting about this? Okay, let's take the mobility gels as an example, right? We start off with two types, the blue gel, aka repulsion, and then the orange gel, aka propulsion, right? So by itself, there's a few interesting gameplay concepts that you can use with these gels. Maybe you have a room around building speed by staying as long as possible on the orange gel, or a room around, using the momentum reversal aspects of blue gels to clear gaps and obstacles. But all things considered, this is like pretty basic stuff, and there's really only so much you can do with these that hasn't really been explored extensively before in other entities. But here is where things gets interesting, because let's do this thing where we introduce the gels on the falling blocks. And now, all of a sudden, all of the previous ideas that were explored with the falling block itself open up as a way to further expand on mobility gels. I can now take all of the interactions and gameplay ideas with a falling block and apply them with a gel. Instead of a normal falling block bouncing on a faith plate, what if you had an orange gel falling block, bouncing on a faith plate, giving this new attribute. It's now non-climbable and it has low friction, so now you have to focus more on air control and positioning and precision. What if, instead of trying to keep up with a falling block through multiple portals, we now have a blue falling block going through multiple portals that you have to keep up with, and also use the bouncy properties to navigate through the level. And see how by doing like this minor thing, which is put the gel on the falling block, now we've exponentially increased the number of ideas that we have for this mechanic. Previously, before the mobility gel was introduced, we explored a room that was all about a falling block acting as intermediary platforms, right? So they essentially appear through portals as a sort of cycle. For a brief moment, the falling block is there, and you have to use these brief moments to navigate through the room. Now, we have mobility gels on falling blocks, so we can explore different types of falling blocks appearing in these cycles, giving you moments of safety, followed by moments of danger. In this room, we explore a large falling block that you use to guide your way through the room. Now with the gels, we can explore a falling block covered in orange gel to guide your way through the room, with this added element of lower friction, forcing you to be more aware of your movements and how the momentum can affect you. And I can go on and on about this. I really think this is something that anyone can apply to their own levels. I've had people ask me stuff like, how I come up with ideas, or how I had so much mapping juice for this map in particular, and I think a big factor for that is just how well the mechanics I chose work with each other. This might be a bit of a weird comparison, but I think a common practice when you're writing character-driven stories involve establishing characters with these sort of interesting dynamics and characteristics to help facilitate the rest of the story, right? As the author, you don't necessarily have to write a story from scratch. You write interesting characters first, and the story will sort of naturally form around their dynamic. So, in a similar way, you don't necessarily have to come up with ideas from scratch for your mechanics. Instead, you choose mechanics that will naturally come up with ideas for you. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is some definitive way that level design should work. This is just something that worked for me personally in Test Chamber 317. And I think in general can be like a helpful guideline for coming up with gameplay ideas, especially for my personal style of gameplay. That being said, I think the subject of creating interesting, unique gameplay goes a lot further, and probably much deeper as we dive into, different styles of gameplay, and then like mapper intentions, and so on and so forth. So back onto the subject of this level's design philosophy. Another aspect of this level that I put a lot of thought into had to be regarding pacing and how I want players to experience this map. Now, to put it bluntly, this map wasn't made to be accessible. Obviously, it's Grandmaster. That being said, I went into the map with a pretty obvious goal because this was a birthday map. It was made for my good friend, a buff Zucchini, so a lot of this map's level design, pacing, and difficulty was intentionally designed around that initial thought. First and foremost, I know Zucchini's a GM level player. He's comfortable with most difficulties under GM and can probably, play lower level GM maps, which means that was my difficulty ceiling. So for me, this is important to establish because having a higher difficulty ceiling means more potential to explore obscure, unconventional ideas, movements, and inputs without having to worry about accessibility, right? And then from a viewer perspective, the gameplay will have more freedom to look more bombastic, look more intense, and I guess in general just sillier. I also went into the map determined to give it a goofy side, because I know Zucchini is a mischievous little gremlin. I knew he would find these things hilarious. So that's why all the strawberries are trolls.
Just that.
I think one thing I consciously did throughout this level was intentionally pace it in a way that would appeal to most expert and GM level players. So what I mean by this is, if you look at the first checkpoint, it's significantly more focused on gameplay with micro puzzles, gameplay that focuses on unconventional movement and then routing throughout the room, maybe a bit more precision and navigating through spinner mazes. And then as the map proceeds on, I begin opening up the gameplay with more focuses on bombastic, fast-paced movement tech and sort of these big cinematic set pieces. And by the time we reach the final checkpoint, I imagine the player would be more fatigued and less inclined to think hard about the gameplay, so I designed the level to be simpler in a sense. So the moves themselves are simpler, they're not difficult or cryptic to figure out. The level just focuses more on having these big cinematic set pieces to make the gameplay feel cool. let's talk about that. I've wanted to talk about the subject for a really long time, and honestly, it's like one of the main reasons I'm making this video. Cinematics and presentation at your level. I think it matters, and it's not something I see a lot of people discuss about. Alright, take a look at this clip of gameplay as an example. Seems pretty standard, right? Nothing in particular about it is wrong, but nothing really stands out about it either. It's not the type of gameplay that makes players go, wow, you know, this is incredible, memorable stuff. This room has pretty much the same movement and inputs as this room. So what's the difference? What is it that makes the second room feel so much more cinematic and memorable and, you know, for lack of a better word, cool? I think this is also a loaded subject. For one, it's subjective, right? Different players will have different preferences in gameplay. You know, one popular preference is readability, right? Gameplay that's readable, and that makes sense because readable rooms means that you're able to parse that gameplay on the fly, which means you're making very fast moment-to-moment decisions that award you immediately. It's like an immediate dopamine boost, and I think a lot of people love that type of gameplay for a reason. Some players, they'll prefer gameplay that requires some thinking, with, you know, a satisfying payoff once you figure it out. Or, you know, some players might prefer more obscure moves with trial and error. Or maybe, you know, they just want inputs that make their fingers happy. I don't know. Point is, it's very, very subjective. And even the subject of readability, I think, is very subjective because players of different skill levels will find different things more readable, right? For example, someone who beat Farewell and never played any mods will have more difficulty reading a map like Delusional Canopy, right? While a player that has played a lot of Expert and GM maps will probably say that, well, at least for the first half of Delusional Canopy, it's extremely readable and fun to play. So understanding that you'll never truly please everyone is the first step. That being said though, the final checkpoint of Test Chamber 317 was designed to be pretty readable gameplay for players who have played a decent number of GM maps, right? The moves themselves are not very difficult. You can break these rooms down into their individual moves and inputs, and you'll find none of them are super precise, difficult to do, or to figure out. This room, for example, consists of hypering 3 times, and then dashing up a bunch, and then dashing in circles, right? It's not that difficult. This part is literally just press the jump button. This part is, you know, do a super left and right a few times. Although, not a lot of people could read this part. Sorry, that's my bad. I think what makes these rooms stick in memory is everything else that's going on around it. And I know this is going to get into very opinionated territory here, but for me, personally, having a bunch of, like, chaos happening around you, yet having the gameplay still be decipherable, is cool. And I think a lot of people would actually agree with me on this, because it's why people love the Moonberry room in Dark Moon Ruins, or why people love maps like Clockwork, because things are moving around you, you're not sure what's happening, but what you need to do immediately at the moment is clear and easy to see, and that process of instantaneously being able to decipher something is cool. Check out this gameplay room as an example. It seems like, you know, pretty typical tech spam that most GM level players would probably find pretty straightforward, maybe even a little boring. Now, let's add the urgency of keeping up with a block going at light speed through these portals with cinematic and presentational flares like creating this fast rising wall that you have to wall bounce off of, and all of a sudden this room becomes just that much more memorable. This room also seems pretty standard, just navigating through a spinner maze. Now, let's add some urgency and chaos to the presentation with these bouncy falling blocks, and it becomes so much more solidified as a concept that also feels cooler to play. Now, I want to make it clear that I think cinematic value and, you know, these sort of presentational flares I'm bringing up is one aspect that can make your gameplay feel more bombastic and interesting. But at the same time, I don't think it's the only thing that you should focus on, because, you know, falling into this trap can at least in my opinion, very easily change your gameplay into those like auto play, like push right to win Mario levels, which are quite frankly pretty boring, at least in my opinion. I think the key is sort of having a balance between like presentation and then like interesting ideas and concepts, and then interesting inputs and movement. And the discussion I think gets a lot deeper and a lot more nuanced, which I don't really want to get into right now. So yeah, I dove pretty deep into the subject matter, which is, you know, quite frankly, it's a single style of gameplay that I sort of embraced in Test Chamber 317, especially towards the end of this map. And it's one that I personally love a lot, but obviously it's not going to appeal to everyone, which is perfectly fine. I think it's fine we have different mapping styles and subsequently more variety in gameplay, which is always a good thing, I think. Personally, I also love to explore different design philosophies and concepts, so, you know, don't let this ground you into thinking it's the only way to make gameplay. Maybe it can serve as some inspiration, and at the very least, it's just a little peek into how I made this map. Alright, I think that's it. Yeah, I'm glad I could finish making this video, even if it was, you know, less focused and less scripted. I hope it was still entertaining to watch. I had like a bullet point list of different ideas I want to talk about, so hopefully it's actually like cohesive and doesn't just sound like me rambling all over the place. And then yeah, I think as for future plans, I'd love to make more of these like mini devlogs / design commentaries. I think one that I've always wanted to make was for the summer before Christmas, which is my Secret Santa 2023 map. Yeah, 2023. Wait, no, 2022. Wait, no, 2023. Okay, the Secret Santa 2 map. But yeah, we'll see if I get around to that. If I get motivation, maybe I'll make it. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Cheers. Thanks for watching. I will go get food now. It is 4 p.m. and I have not eaten since I woken up. I am very hungry.